So hi Andrew, it's really, really nice to have you here.
Thank you. It's nice
And
to be
thanks
here.
for coming.
Appreciate it.
I would like to start with you telling your story, how
Okay.
you ended up being here in Ness.
All right. So my family is originally, or my ancestors are from this part of Norway on my mother's side. So when I was a kid, we used to come out here. I lived in Austria the first 7 years of my life, and we'd come up here in the summertime. So for me, this part of the country was nature and being out in farms, and my uncle had a strawberry farm, so we'd go pick strawberries and potatoes, and so it was beautiful nature and summertime, and kind of a contrast to somewhat more urban city life we lived in Vienna as a child. And then that was up until I was around 7, and then I spent most of my youth and early adulthood traveling around the world. So I come from an international background. So I lived all over the place. In fact, we moved around so much that I didn't live in one place for over a year until I bought our farm here in Ness in 2009, which was when our son was born. So he's now 10.
10 years ago.
So, yeah. So that's the sort of story. I was living in Oslo in 2006 and 7, and I met my wife, and we decided we wanted to move. We didn't want to raise our child in the city, so we were looking for a place a little bit outside, but still close enough. You know, we worked in the city that we could come into the city and work. So we had a sort of a 1 hour radius, and this is about 1 hour outside of Oslo, and we were looking for small farms actually. Just mostly to be closer to nature and to raise a kid in a more environmentally friendly environment. And then we were looking at different farms, and finally we found the farm that we'll see later, which is here in Ness. And since then we haven't moved.
Yeah, so you found your place.
I feel that way.
Yeah.
Come back to my roots, so to speak, but re-establishing roots.
Yeah. And do you have a background in farming?
Absolutely not.
Yeah.
I grew up in cities all over the world. I mean, there were times when we lived at outskirts of cities, but I never really grew up on farms. We did spend a little bit of time when we first moved to Norway when I was 7, 8 in the forest, in a house in the forest. So my first real connection with nature, non-built nature, wild nature, was walking in the forest, collecting berries and mushrooms.
Yeah.
So yeah, that was the first time when I realized, okay, this is something that I really like. But I didn't really get a chance to reconnect with it until I was a grown man and we bought the house.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. And may I ask, what did you do before you ended up being on that farm? What was your profession?
So I studied at the University of Oslo, philosophy, intellectual history, and anthropology. And then I went on to study at London School of Economics, anthropology of learning and cognition. But then I wasn't able to turn that into any kind of work. And I ended up working for Apple at first because they needed people who were educated and had both Nordic language skills and English language skills. So I moved over in about 2004 to IT.
Yeah.
And I spent 10 years in IT before I started moving more towards ecology and environmentalism, really. So that was like sort of a gradual transition of, since I had philosophy as a background and ethics was especially important to me, always been interested in how ideas connect with the way people live.
Yeah.
And ethics is very much a part of that. And so at some point I realized that I wanted to create a world in which I was able to live ethically in accordance with my ethics. And one of the principles of virtue ethics, which is the ethical system that I follow, is that you're supposed to start with yourself and then move on to your family and your municipality and then on out, depending on how much energy you have at any given time. And I realized that for me, the time in which we were in, this is 2003 to 2007, the real crisis of our time was global warming.
Yeah.
And I sort of became more and more aware of that during those years. And I felt like, okay, if you're going to live ethically in this world, that means choosing to be active in relationship to the needs of the time, and not just your own individual needs, but the needs of your community. So there was a connection definitely between my education in intellectual history and philosophy and anthropology and doing something active. At the same time, I didn't have any kind of natural science education. I never really did spend much time in nature. And so a lot of the value systems that I had, like most people, were anthropocentric values, that is to say, human-centered values. And the global crisis that we have is not really so much about human-centered values, but it's about ecosystem values. And to be able to understand that properly, you have to understand ecology. You have to be able to understand nature. And not having any natural sciences in my education, I felt the need to slowly build up more and more knowledge about the natural world, and to try and understand what was it that was wrong. Right? Why is there a crisis? I didn't understand it.
Yeah.
And to be honest, when I started reading it, I would get really fatigued, like carbon and all this offsetting and trading. What is all this? I didn't, So in the beginning, it was very difficult.
And this happened already when you were working at Apple?
At Apple, yeah. 2004 to 2006 is when it really started happening.
Yeah.
And also, from a sort of political perspective at that time, there was the Iraq War. And I didn't like the fact that my energy, a third of my energy, or at least a good chunk of my energy, was going to the war effort, as in anybody who pays taxes to a government that's at war is, a part of the problem, so to speak. So that bothered me, and I was thinking, how am I going to not do that anymore?
Yeah.
And my solution was, actually I heard a podcast about it, and I was, well, your solutions are simple. You either don't pay taxes, which is breaking the law, or you leave the country. so I was like, wow, that's pretty simple. I'll just leave the country. And it was no problem for me because I've been traveling my whole life anyway. So I was like, okay, I'm just not going to, I don't want to be a part of that karma or that cycle of destruction. And I was go back to those strawberry farms of my ancestors. So I was sort of, go back to Norway again. And so, moved back in 2006. Yeah.
And then it started, And can you tell a bit more about what you actually then ended up doing? What do you do now?
Right.
What is your work about?
So I spent 10 years in IT and in management, and then I became more and more disillusioned there as well. I mean, now I'm not paying taxes to the American government, but I'm still putting all my energy into creating digital value, right? And I realized more and more that there was something in me it's not good enough. I need to be doing more than just, I partook in politics, local politics for the Green Party, and went to rallies and all that kind of, what they call slacktivism. I like this, I don't like that, but it just wasn't. It didn't feel like I was, in a crisis situation. I felt anyway that, I remember my grandfather told me that before he died, that Pearl Harbor was the pivotal moment of his generation, right? He fought in World War II. And he said every generation has a pivotal moment, of something that defines that generation. And he says you need to find out what it is that's the defining issue of your generation and deal with that. Be a part of progress, be a part of improving the world, and not just being, right? And that made a big impression on me. And when I tried to figure out what that was, it was definitely global warming. I mean, there was no bigger issue to deal with. And then the question is, how are you going to find a way to live where you're constantly active and moving in the right direction and moving your society in the right direction? So a lot of it was, of course, like with anything else, you have to go through the process of understanding the problem before you can really do anything about it. But gradually, I got more and more involved in politics. And the first big action that I got involved in was to try and get the Norwegian bank to divest from Monsanto. Because the Norwegian bank, I don't know, most people know that Norway is one of the richest countries in the world, and we have the world's biggest sovereign wealth fund, which is made out of all this massive amounts of money that come from oil, which of course is the crux, really the crux of the problem, or very close to the crux of the problem of global warming. And this seemed like something tangible. Okay, if we can get the Norwegian bank to divest, that is to say, sell their investment in Monsanto. At that time, Monsanto had big projects in India where they had lots of children working for them in terrible conditions, and with sprays. And anyway, there was a huge problem. That was something that I thought this was something we could do, right? So we, as in several environmental organizations, had a conference and brought in scientists from all over the world and tried to connect that with politicians and the investment management side. Sadly, nothing materialized out of that other than the conference, which is online. You can watch it on YouTube. But as far as I know, the Norwegian bank is still invested in Monsanto, which now has been bought up by, I can't remember the name of it, a German company.
Yeah, of course.
Big agrochemical company.
Yeah. So this is the political side of your work, but I know you also do a lot of things in practice.
Exactly.
So can you tell me more about your practical work?
Yeah. So, based on ethics of doing something, whatever one can do in the situation, for me, my energy in terms of politics wasn't really paying off the way I felt. And you have to sort of get into some sort of positive feedback loop where whatever you're doing feeds you. It gives you joy, it gives you energy, and that's, you're not just draining yourself. And that's a really important part of maintaining your own health. And to be able to stay active. And so I felt like, at first, when I left the States for Europe, I was really big on alternative energy. So solar panels, that was my big thing, right? So solar panels on roofs, solar panels everywhere, electric cars, solar panels, right? And so in the Green Party, I was very active with, or I should say active, with the techno-optimist branch of the Green Party. Which basically, if you're going to sum up what the philosophy there is that we can continue the life we have, the capitalist consumerist world. We need to limit the consumption a bit, but we can mostly just replace fossil fuels with alternative energy. Bingo, problem solved. And after years of thinking about it and looking at it and reading about it, I realized that's not going to be enough. It just doesn't cut it. Firstly, it's not happening fast enough, and even if it does, there's a much deeper problem that has to be dealt with. And so I started moving more towards working with ecosystems. And I didn't know anything about it. So when we got our farm in 2009, it wasn't before 2012 that I planted anything at all. And then I literally just had the farmer, take his tractor and make some space, and I started planting plants. Maybe 30% of those plants survived, right? Yeah. And it was just overrun by weeds, and it was a catastrophe. And then I got totally disillusioned. So, that was 2011 or 12, and then the following year I did nothing. Right, and I got depressed, and I just focused on work.
It was a hard thing.
Well, it is tough. Like if you have no in retrospect, I should have understood that, if you don't have any practice in something and you're getting involved in it and you've never had any teachers or anything, you're not going to succeed right away. That's just how it works. But I got introduced through the Green Party to the Norwegian Seed Savers, which is a community seed bank. The whole community seed bank revolution has been exploding, since the 70s. Started really in the States with Seed Savers Exchange. And basically what it does is it tries to take care of cultivars, rare cultivars, plants that humans have had relations with for thousands of years, right? And that have almost become extinct, right? And huge amounts of our cultivars have become extinct, right? And I think the National Geographic puts it somewhere at 80 to 85% of the American cultivars have gone extinct. So there's a lot of work to be done there, and not very many people who are doing the work. And that kind of work can't be done by companies. It has to be done by individuals, farms, people who are interested in taking care of the genetic diversity. So I got introduced to the Norwegian seed savers, and especially Stephen Barstow, who's still today the leader of the Norwegian seed savers, was really the sort of shining light example showing everybody else what you can do in extreme environments. Norway is extreme. Plants, you have to remember, this whole area here was under an ice sheet 20,000 years ago. So all of the biodiversity that you see here has moved here in the last 20,000 years, right? And humans have really only started bringing plants in of any substance in the last 2,000 years. And even then, it wasn't before we discovered America, the Europeans did anyway. Other people had already discovered it, but when the Europeans discovered it, then they started bringing in all kinds of biodiversity, cultivated plants, right? So a lot of the plants that Norwegians consider to be traditional Norwegian vegetables, and they're not from Norway. They have nothing to do with Norway. They're new. Potatoes only 300 years old here in Norway, and that's what, meat and potatoes, So with Stephen, he has this book, Around the World in 80 Plants, and he moved here in the 80s, vegetarian, and there was nothing in the stores, so he had to just grow everything himself, right? And he just dug up his lawn and started planting all kinds of stuff. Terrible conditions, really, he thought. And he realized after a while that annuals don't work, so he moved over to perennials. And then he moved more and more towards more hardy perennials, and now he's tried some 3,000 plus plants.
Amazing amount.
It's ridiculous. You should, go to see his place, and it's like everywhere. Just, and he has, of course, he's a scientist, so he has control, and he understands it all. So that was an inspiration. I went up and visited him in 2015 and got a bunch of plants and seeds. It's an amazing story, actually. I was there in November, which is a good time to collect seeds. And I had this list of like 50 plants that I read his book, and these are the plants that I want. And so he goes onto his computer and he, he makes a list, and he goes, okay, gives me a tray, and we go out and stand in his garden. And it's like, you see, when you film on fast forward, that's what it was like. I was just standing there for like 10 minutes, and this old man with a gray beard just zoom, 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 and he would come back with a plant and come back with a plant. And so in like 10 minutes, I had a tray with like 50 different species, right?
So he came with the plant, not with seeds.
Seeds as well. So we went around and collected seeds, but some plants need to be, or perennials, it's much more easy to establish a 2-3-year-old plant than to sow it from seed. So that really kick-started for me the move towards, okay, this is something I want to do more of. I want to slowly build. And so, 2014, 2015, it started to happen. I was like, this is starting to work. And I started listening to podcasts about, permaculture, introduced to the whole permaculture movement. And Eric Tonsmeyer wrote a book called The Paradise Lot, where he just turns a little tiny area, I mean, we're talking 200 square meters, turns it in from urbanite, where nothing was growing. In 5 to 10 years, he's built this whole ecosystem, right, from scratch. And I was like, that makes sense. That's something I can do. It's right outside my door. I can see it. I can react to it, right? And here are the people are giving me all this information. They know how to do this stuff. Well, I just have to copy what they're doing. They're even giving me the seeds and the plants, right? Simple, right?
So you got inspired.
I got inspired. Then, of course, the hail came. And the wind. And all my squash plants died. And I got depressed again. And Stephen said, don't go for more annuals. Go for more perennials. Go for more hardy plants. And I was like, no, but I like squash. I like tomatoes. And so I realized, okay, I want to build some kind of a structure. So I thought, first I built these tiny little greenhouses. And I grew tomatoes in these, just handmade. Just recycled glass windows, basically. Raised beds with little glass. Ones. Not, this one wasn't pretty. But it worked. And yeah, I started making hule beds and, and then I started, okay, I need a greenhouse. I was thinking 30 to 50 square meters would be good. And on my way to work, I saw right over here by the church we passed earlier, nice big greenhouse. I was like, okay, I'll go and check and ask him. He probably knows where I can get a good greenhouse.
Yeah.
And he goes, 80-year-old, gardener, and he was retiring. He goes, well, you can buy this one from me. I was like, that's a big greenhouse, 300 square meters.
Yeah.
I was like, I thought about it for a while. I ended up buying it from him for $1,000.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
I mean, you can get that little greenhouse over there costs $1,000, right? But then, of course, whenever you do something like that, in permaculture, there's something that says, start with slow and simple, small solutions. Of course, being from Texas and, thinking globally, I thought, just get a big, huge greenhouse,
Start big.
Start big, which I do not advise people to do that.
Yeah.
But, so it took a whole winter of taking it apart, raising it again. So in 20th of May, 2016, we finally got the structure up. And I remember when we were done putting up the cover on it, and I was in there in this bare, empty greenhouse, 300 square meters, like, oh my God, now I have to fill this thing with plants.
Yeah.
so
was it inspiring, or was it more of a scary scenario?
Well, you and I yesterday were talking about trade-offs.
Yes.
And no matter what choice you make in life, there are pros and cons, right? So suddenly I have this space in which I can grow just about anything, right?
Yeah.
But the question then becomes, how do you do that sustainably?
Yeah.
How do you do that ethically, right? On permaculture principles. Because you have to remember, the greenhouse was a monocultural production unit.
Yes.
It was not a reproduction greenhouse, right? He just grew plants on tables.
Yeah.
And he fired the thing, he heated the thing up with oil.
Okay.
And he wanted to sell me his oil heater as well. And I was like, nope, I'm not doing oil at all. So then it becomes the challenge of, okay, well, and he looked at me and was like, you're going to do greenhouses without heating it?
Yeah.
And I was like, So I read Coleman's, How to Grow, I forget the name of the book right now, but it's basically how to grow in northern climates in greenhouses.
Yeah.
And that was a really good book, right? To sort of, okay, this is what these are the things you have to think about, And he takes that, to heat or not to heat. And his conclusion is basically heat.
Yeah.
Right, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to, is to keep it or at least as minimal as possible. And so, became more and more aware of how that works, and that's something that every year has gotten a little bit better, I'd say. Yeah.
So Andrew, if I understood correctly, you don't call yourself a farmer.
No.
So if I would say that rather what you want to be called is an ecosystem builder.
Yeah.
Would that be correct?
That's right. So
what does it mean then to?
Yeah, I mean the difference.
Restoring?
The difference really is that it has to do with what you put in the center. Like, what's the most important thing? And the reason why I got into growing in the first place was as a part of applying an ethical system to my life, so that what I was doing would reflect my value system. And in permaculture, a lot of it is about, observing and interacting, but actually just going out and doing it. It's like, you can't just think and talk, you have to go out and do it. And you'll learn by practicing, you'll learn by doing. So for me, it really is about building ecosystems, is about firstly understanding the basic principles of ecology, because you can't build an ecology if you don't understand how it works. And that's a never-ending process. Anybody who tells you they know how ecosystems work are lying. It's a massively, there is no more complicated subject than ecosystems, right?
Yeah.
But at the same time, we're all embedded in ecosystems, and it's impossible, even though we like to fool ourselves that we can, to separate ourselves from ecosystems. So the key is to try and then understand and then apply that knowledge in a sort of a feedback loop of learn, interact, and then continue to make progress, right? So in my case, I'm dealing with the mistakes of industrial agriculture by recycling a big greenhouse, right? That was a production unit, and I'm going to try and turn it into a reproduction unit, right? A stable ecosystem, that's the aim, not something that I can make a lot of money off of. on purpose not thinking about money, right? So I want to try and move in the direction of how can I surround myself by plants that I'm related to somehow through a practice, right? And luckily, I would listen to a lot of podcasts on my way to work and back. And one of them was Sustainable World Radio with Dr. Elaine Ingham, who is probably the world's expert on soil ecology. So she's primarily focused on the top 30 centimeters of soil. And how do you build, what is this good soil ecology?
Yeah.
And so starting from there, I realized after my mistakes in the first 2 years that you can't look at ecology just by what you see. You have to think of it in terms of, what's happening underneath the surface is more important than what's happening above, right?
Invisible things.
Right, the stuff that lays underneath, right? So instead of just growing on top of the soil, I worked on building the soil. So the beginning, you've seen the greenhouse, there's like 6 rows of raised beds, right? And they're 15, 20 centimeter high cases, which is again recycled waste, right? Industrial waste. And then I filled them all up with wheelbarrows, right? So first I just laid down cardboard, and then I added 1 wheelbarrow of soil and 1 wheelbarrow of finished compost, another wheelbarrow of soil, and so on, right? And then I made different varieties as I moved forward, as I built, right? Never build more than 2 a day. That's what I learned. That's enough work, right? 2 of those a day. And of course, the first year I only filled half the greenhouse the first year.
Yeah.
I didn't finish filling it before last year, right? And then you have to learn, once you've built the good soil, and it needs to have 20% oxygen, it needs to be alive with worms, it has to be alive with all kinds of microorganisms, right? You learn how to feed the soil. So the first practice is the medium in which you're growing, right? Once you have that established, you can almost grow anything in it, right? And you won't have to worry about bugs and all that other stuff that you have to worry about when you're doing industrial agriculture, because healthy soil makes healthy plants. When a plant, in an ecosystem, if a plant is unhealthy, that's the ones that the bugs attack, right? So now they'll attack healthy ones too if they're hungry, but generally speaking, they go for the weak ones first, right? So basically my idea was, okay, introduce first the simplest plants, right? Alliums, onions, right? Super easy. I'd already been growing those outdoors, right? I had tried to grow tomatoes and squash and cucumbers, and I'd managed to grow squash, which isn't too hard. Yeah. And so I continued growing what I'd already been growing indoors, which is, after succeeding in a small setting, upscale up. So the first year I figured, okay, I have to fill half this greenhouse. Half of it was just squash, right? Huge amount. But of course I tried to play with all the different varieties instead of just growing a lot of it, because I want to learn. I want to find out, well, what works best in this environment, right? And of course, since I'm interested in the reproduction side of it, saving seeds and not production, I had to learn. So I spent the winter time reading about the plants and researching, right? And again, using the network. Here, the internet is extremely helpful, right? You can order seeds from anywhere on the planet. You can do research on whatever plant at any time, right? And I wanted to maintain traditions at the same time. So one of the plants that I was started off with is Shetland kale. So I'm half Scottish, and the Shetland Islands are in between Scotland and Norway. So that was a logical, and it's an heirloom, which is to say, it's a endangered variety. In the 50s, there were 54 farms in Shetland that grew Shetland kale, and now there's like 10. Right? So I researched and found out how did they grow them. It was 30% of the calories of Shetland from both animals and people were just from that one plant, right? Okay. And so basically learning from the past, learning and then applying that, and then trying new things all the time. But relating it always to global warming as well, right? So you want to be doing whatever your practice is, it should have a regenerative aspect, as in you're building more nutrients, you're adding carbon to the soil, you're not taking it out. and also you're helping your ecosystem adapt, right? And that's one of the reasons why I'm so interested in reproduction as well.
Yeah.
Is that if plants aren't allowed to reproduce, then they're not going to be adapting, right?
Yes.
And modern agriculture is very much about not having plants adapt to their ecosystems. It's instead anthropocentric, human-centered, as how can we make a plant give us what we want, right? So the difference between an ecosystem builder and a farmer is, in our age, a farmer, before they were the same thing, but now a farmer is out there creating value for humans, production value, whereas an ecosystem builder is looking at how do you increase the stability of the ecosystem that you are a part of. Yeah.
That's interesting. So what I hear now is that through your work, you basically realized two things: that there's a difference between directing your work towards production or directing it towards reproduction.
Right.
Can you maybe elaborate a bit more about that?
So in the beginning I didn't really understand it, but the more you read about it, the more you actually interact with it, the more you become aware of that, plants go through different cycles. They have the production cycle, in which in the beginning they have to put on weight, they have to, they photosynthesizing, they're focusing on leaf in the beginning, usually. And then at some stage they're like, okay, I have enough energy now, I'm gonna reproduce. And then they bolt. They shoot up, right? And they make flowers, and then they attract the insects, and then they stop putting their energy into as much photosynthesis, right? And instead they go from production mode to reproduction mode, right? And that fascinated me because that's obviously at the crux of seed saving, right? But what is this thing? What is this reproduction actually, right? Why is it, how come we live in a world that's so focused on production, which seems to me to be only, maybe not even the most important part of what's happening with a plant?
So
right?
we usually don't allow it to go to that reproduction state.
Well, it depends, right? The thing is that if we do allow it to go to the reproduction stage, as in the case with wheat, right? We're interested in the seed for wheat for consumption. We're not actually, most farmers are not interested in the seed for reproduction. They're interested in it so we can eat the seed. And of course, humans are, mammals who used to collect seeds. That was our prime objective, 60 million years ago. Reproduce yourself by going around collecting energy. And seeds are concentrated energy. So, but from the modern human perspective, we think of seed production as an example of wheat or corn, primarily as through a sort of primitive mammalian perspective, right? It's something we can eat, right? So it's a production unit in our minds. We're producing the seed, right? A seed saver doesn't look at it like that. Yes, you can eat seed, but the aim of the seed is stable ecosystems over time, right? How does an ecosystem maintain stability over time? Through reproduction. That's how it manages to change, because the world is, the biosphere has always gone through cycles, colder cycles, warmer cycles, right? And as those cycles change, plants have had to adapt. And one of the methods they use to adapt is reproduction, right? And so that's a key element of ecosystem stability, is seed or just reproduction, the reproduction level. So delving deeper into that, since I studied philosophy and intellectual history, I was interested in this from the perspective of understanding what's happening in an ecosystem, right? And I don't know if to sort of bring back the history, I ended up studying ecology at a school nearby here, or organic agriculture actually. But my aim was to study ecology. And in those studies, I started digging into the history, the intellectual history of ecology, to try and find out, well, what are the core principles? Because you don't really learn that in organic agriculture, right? You basically learn conventional agriculture minus sprays, right? So it's still production thinking. Whereas I was clear when I started studying, I'm going to do ecosystems building, not farming, right? So when digging, of course, Darwin goes without saying, you can't understand ecology if you haven't understood the basics of evolution.
Yeah.
That's the beginning of the ecological revolution, right? 150 years ago. But then there are other major events in the ecological intellectual history. So that is to say, the history of ideas that have helped us understand how ecology works, right? Darwin is the beginning. There were definitely thinkers before him, but that's the real beginning. And what happened in between, you know? So I wanted to bridge the gap between ecology as a science, in my mind, and practice, actually being out there and doing something with the ecology. Yeah. In that process, there are several main thinkers, but one of the core ideas is the idea of entropy, right? The second law of thermodynamics, right? And basically what that says is that energy, which is critical to understanding any ecosystem, is where is the energy coming from and where is it going? How is it flowing through the ecosystem? Energy goes from a concentrated form to a dissipated form. That's the way energy works. That's the second law of thermodynamics, right? Now, you know, thermodynamics starts in the study of it starts in 1860 with the Industrial Revolution. It actually has to do with engines. They're trying to understand how engines work. But then the physicists go deep into it to try and understand it. Schrödinger is one of these great, physicists who writes a book in 1944 called What is Life? And he talks about entropy. That's actually where I really started to understand, or I feel understand more. Yeah. It's like saying you understand, the space-time continuum. I'm not Einstein, but at least I understood more after reading him than before. And he says that life is about two processes, right? It's order from order processes and order from disorder processes, right? And he says, one of those, I'm a physicist, so one of those I can explain to you, and that's entropy, right? I can explain to you that energy goes from the sun to the earth, concentrated to dissipated. Plants photosynthesize, they catch that energy and they turn it into sugars, right? Claro, no problem, right? He explains that in the beginning of the paper. He says, but what I can explain to you, that's order from disorder, right? So energy goes from order to disorder, and plants go from disorder to order again. That's called Schrödinger's paradox, which means basically Schrödinger says, how is it possible that the second law of thermodynamics says energy goes from a concentrated form to a dissipated form, but life seems to be doing the opposite? Yes. And that's an important observation from an ecosystem's perspective. Why is it that life seems to be making order out of disorder, whereas entropy says energy goes from order to disorder? Yeah. Anyway, the crux of this paper, What is Life, Schrödinger, is to try and answer that. Yeah. Probably the first time somebody really tried to answer that question, right? Yeah. And his answer is, to answer this, I have to take off my physicist hat and put on a biologist hat. Yeah. And he said, and biologists are God. Physicists, nothing. Yeah. At that time, that was revolutionary, because then everybody was into physics. Yeah. Nobody cared about biology. Yeah. It's only in the last 30 years that biology has really become, so he's ahead of his time, right? And he says, so that's order from disorder, entropy. The other side, it seems to have something to do with, DNA, it's genetic, and it's an order from order process. Yeah. It's not the same as, right? So if you think in terms of reproduction and production, entropy offsetting, which is what photosynthesis is, or when we metabolize, when we're breathing or eating, right? That's order from disorder, right? The disorder is constantly happening to life. Yeah. Entropy is always there, and we have to fight it. It's not really, in a sense you could say it's a struggle, but it's just a part of what it means to be alive. We're always breathing. Plants are always photosynthesizing. As soon as we have the chance, we digest, right? We're making order out of disorder. And humans are extremely obsessed with that, right? The reproduction side is order from order. And that side, like Schrödinger says, we didn't know much about it in the 40s, right? 10 years after Schrödinger says that, Watson and Crick discover the DNA, the double helix, right? And when they do, in their Nobel Prize speech, they attribute the discovery to Schrodinger's What is Life, right? So this is a critical, from an intellectual history perspective, forget about ecology intellectual history, just intellectual history of all time. This is a critical, pivotal event, right? Discovery, understanding, insight into how the world works. Yeah.
Wow. Wow, amazing. So I think that the ecosystem reacted to our conversation because the wind really blew our mind and got excited about entropy and all of those things you were talking about and brought us here. And I would really want to explore a bit further, because when I hear what you're saying, when I hear how you speak about what you do with the plants and how you work with them, and how much you really do spend time with the plants in the greenhouse and outdoors. It seems to me that you really not only know your plants, but also really create relationships with the surroundings.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting transition to go from a world where you work with computers and symbols all the time, which was my world, you know, a square, constantly staring at some kind of a liquid crystal interacting interface, to a world where you're surrounded by green and all the different colors, and there are no symbols in that ecology, right? It's actually quite a big contrast, and in the beginning I didn't really understand the significance of the difference, but after a while I started thinking about it. Well, what is the difference between these two kinds of ecosystems? You know, a human-made ecosystem and a more natural biological ecosystem. And when I was studying ecology, I learned very early on about something called emergence, or emergent properties. There's another one of the key ideas of ecology, and it's something that you also find in philosophy of mind. It's called supervenience in philosophy of mind. But basically the idea is that properties have evolved over time, so that, you know, metabolism, for instance, right? It didn't just show up out of nowhere. It was built on earlier systems, right? And consciousness, the mind, is an emergent property that's based on earlier evolution, right? And in that earlier, you know, you can't have consciousness without metabolism. You can't have consciousness without photosynthesis. Those things are linked, but we don't really think about it that way. We think about consciousness as being something that we own. That's a part of the human realm, right? And to a certain extent, there is truth to that, because it's a recent, from an ecosystem's perspective, consciousness is a recent phenomenon, right? It's only, let's be generous and say, 3 million years that we've had anything that resembles the kind of consciousness that we have now. And that consciousness is very much reliant on code, if you want to put it that way, and that is symbolic, right? So when you and I are talking now, we're exchanging code, right? I'm telling you something, you're telling me something, and we're communicating with the ether through code. And we're all built on this code structure. Consciousness is, the fabric of it is built off of the communication of this code. That supervenes, or, you know, it has emerged, it lays on top of a lower level of, or, lower isn't the right word, but a more fundamental level of biology, right? And biology lays on a more fundamental level of chemistry, and chemistry lays on a more fundamental level, which is physics, right? So as they go up, this is why, again, Schrödinger, biology is much more interesting than physics, right? We understand physics, but we don't really understand biology. We definitely don't understand consciousness. He says that also in his paper, What is Life, right? So, but for me at least, trying to move up the ladder to consciousness, I don't pretend that I understand what that is, although we're a part of it. Definitely a part of my experience is to understand ecology, you have to work at one level at a time, right? You can't just focus on you know, you have to be able to see what it is you're interacting with on that level. So you have to look at the biological level on the biological level, which is almost impossible for us to do, conscious beings, because we default to our minds. We default to the symbolic realm, and we turn everything into symbols, right? That's what we do. That's our function, so to speak, in an ecosystem. But biology is free of symbols, actually, and it's much older than consciousness, right? So to interact with it, really interact with it, and without translating it into consciousness always, you have to release yourself from the symbolic realm, right? And try and interact on the biological realm, right? It's sort of a cage in a sense that you have to escape from, and you can't really, right? But you kind of try anyway, right? And for me at least, one critical aspect of being able to do that is to try and not translate everything into symbols. So in the ecosystem that I'm building, I try and interact on a biological level by sensing what is it that that plant needs, right? Or what is it that the whole ecosystem needs at any given time, intuitively and biologically, just by the senses, right? Does this plant need more nitrogen, or does it need more, right? So I'm using consciousness as a tool to enhance my ecology. I'm not using my ecology as a tool to enhance my consciousness, which is what most people do, right? Our world is pretty much just based on, we want to enhance the human symbolic value constantly, constantly, constantly. And my opinion is that global warming is an imbalance between an over-focus on the symbolic, human creation, anthropocentrism, right? Consciousness building, and ecosystems building. We've been doing so much symbol building for so long that we've become detached from the foundation, right? And in an ecology, you need to know what the foundation is, and then you need to know what the first story is, and the second story, and then the roof, right? But if you don't, and you're not sure what level you're at any given time, and you confuse all the levels, right? Which is what most people do, you won't understand the importance of having that foundation to begin with. Consciousness has emerged on the foundation of a stable ecology. It would never have emerged without stable ecology over millions of years, right? And the individual, which is what our society is focused on, you know, at least for the last couple hundred years, the individual is just a part of an ecology, right? And it's not even, we think of individuals as being from our birth to our death. That's sort of the egocentric self. It's, you know, in ecological philosophy, they call it the ego self. But ecology, you know, the philosophy of ecology, people like Arne Næss and Hans Jonas, they talk about the ecological self, which is a totally different kind of understanding of what it means to be alive, right? It's understanding that, you know, this consciousness has emerged over time, but that you and I, all of us, we're individuals in a spectrum, right? And it's the form that is continuous, right? It doesn't stay still, the form changes, but it's the continuation of the form that's interesting, right? The individuals are just manifestations of the continuation of the form and its movement, right? And all the energy that flows through us, all the matter that flows through us, right? That's what we think to be us. But really, on a deeper level, it's the form that's interesting, right? And this is all visible when you study ecology. These are basic fundamentals of ecology, right? So, yeah.
Is this visible when you interact with your plants?
Definitely. So, you know, since plants have not evolved in the direction of consciousness, symbolic consciousness, they don't have that emergent property. They're free of the symbolic cage, so to speak, right? Now, there are trade-offs always as the environments evolve, as ecologies evolve. And we can't trade away our consciousness. That's where we are now. But the question is really, what are we using it for, right? And my thought is that we've become so obsessed with it that that's the thing that we're putting all our energy into. Instead, I think, to re-stabilize our relationship with our environment, we have to put that aside and then interact with ecology in the aim of building stable ecologies. So to do that, you have to be in practice, in your ecology, and interact with all the different levels, right? So we were talking about soil ecology. But then you move on from there to plant ecology, right? And yeah, as we'll see later, there's many different layers in a stable ecology, not just one, right? So the human mind, because we're symbolic, so we put everything in black and white, male, female, these categories that we build. Then we put that idea into nature and we say, okay, we need to organize everything, right? Get all these plants all evened out and, get them all, they're only we need to harvest them for 2 weeks only. And, we'll have one monoculture, a huge amount, and we'll be able to eat that, right? But that doesn't actually work with an ecology. And that's why we're misaligned, right? We've misunderstood what a stable ecology is. We haven't even thought about it, right? And so now the emergence that's happening, the consciousness, consciousness is continuing to evolve now to a bigger level, a more all-encompassing awareness of our ecological self, which goes back to mitochondrial DNA, 2 billion years of evolution. We all have that. That is what we are, right? Multicellular organisms related to trees, related to mushrooms, right? This is the story, right? And we have to find out how to maintain that stability into the future. That's what a stable ecology is trying to do. It's not to consume as much for one individual lifetime as possible. No. That's to only think in terms of production, right? The reproduction side says long-term, stable ecosystems, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this makes me come back to the concept of regeneration and regenerative agriculture, if you will. How you speak a lot about ecology and about the ecosystems and such, and how do you then understand what is regeneration in the first place, and what place does it have in terms of farming or planting or agriculture?
Right. So again, you have to take everything back to the ethic, right? So if you have an ecological self perspective instead of an ego self perspective, you see yourself as being a part of the biosphere. So you're not just a part of the ecology around you, the farm that you live on, but you're connected to the entire biosphere. And you want to do that which is stable for that ecology. This is the core of ecological ethics, It's Aldo Leopold, it's Hans Jonas, and basically do whatever you act, whatever you're doing should be to enhance the stability of the biosphere, right? So yeah. In practice, what does that mean, right? In terms of regenerative agriculture, I think a lot of people nowadays are thinking about regenerative agriculture primarily in terms of carbon, right? In terms of how, agriculture has been focused on nitrogen since World War I, and now we're realizing, okay, we're all out of balance. We have to find some way to bring carbon back, sequester carbon. That's the big thing, right? But agroecology, regenerative agriculture, it has to start with an ethic that says, understand what an ecology is and find a way to live so that you create more ecology, not less. If every year you're farming and you're destroying your ecology a little bit more, a little bit more, a little bit less carbon, a little bit more nitrogen, it's becoming more and more unstable, then you get to the tipping point, which is where we're headed. We have like 10 years left to figure out how to balance out that tipping point. It's not a lot of time, right? And it's not going to be enough to just calculate it on the physics, on the chemistry level. It has to be an idea change, right? We have to change our focus from egocentricity to geocentricity, right? To ecocentricity, where we're all one unit and we're not stuck in our individual lifespans, but we're part of this evolving phenomenon, which is extremely beautiful, right? It's just amazing. But if you divide it up into units and you say that each unit is competing with the other unit and that's what this is all about, that becomes ugly. That destroys it, right? But when everything works together in harmony like ecosystems do when they're resonating, if you can see the difference between a healthy ecosystem. You can feel the difference, right? If you're paying attention, you can sense that this ecosystem is happy. It's doing well, it's thriving, right? And out of that comes more emergence, newer that's it'll regenerate itself when you're on the right wavelength. You don't have to put a lot of effort into it. However, when you fall off, which is what we're doing, then it's hard work, real hard work to get back, right? So regenerative agriculture for me is putting the ecosystem first, really understanding the fundamentals first of ecology, and then building on that, so that you are able to live in harmony to a greater extent than we are doing today, so that you can continue to enhance the biotic community instead of degenerating it.
So what I hear you say is that regeneration is not only looking beneath the soil and the carbon, but it's also looking on the top of the soil for the whole...
And it's not only looking at an ecology in terms of individuals or individual time or individual generations, which is production, but it's looking at it in terms of long-term ecosystem stability, reproduction, right? So it is a gestalt switch, as they say, right? Yeah. This is what Arne Næss talks about. We need a gestalt switch. We have to move the way we interact with each other, the way we interact with nature, the way we understand what's meaningful, and that will then affect the way we act. And then as we swap, all our values swap as well. You see this in intellectual history. It happens all the time. When we went from a geocentristic worldview, where the world was the center of the universe, to a heliocentristic view, where the sun was the center of the universe, our whole society changed, right? And that's what we need now. So we need a change in the symbolic realm that takes symbols and humans out of the center, just like we took the earth out of the center of our cosmology 500 years ago, and put ecology. So in a way, we're putting the earth back in the center again, right? But it's in the center of our action now. It's not just in the center of our cosmology, right? Instead of everything revolving around the stars and everything revolving around the earth, that's not the important thing. The thing is, how can we take care of this thing, right? Yeah. That's it.
So is it fair to say that to you, regenerative agriculture is not only a technique, but it's also a change of human beings and their way of seeing themselves as part of something?
I think it's the beginning. We're only seeing the beginnings of regenerative agriculture, right? And so there are many different branches within it. I'm in the permaculture branch, right? Which is much more about, it's much more about small. It's much more about starting with yourself, tending your garden, moving on from there, right? Don't bite off more than you can chew. Don't think that you're going to be able to feed the universe, right? Feed yourself. Then feed the soil, then feed your family, and then you can move on from there. But if you don't know how to do that in principle, you need to make sure that you get the foundation right first, right? Yeah, and you can't do that by just jumping on a tractor and plowing stuff, right? That's the problem, right? Right there is that we think we can just fix our problems with more machines. More chemistry and more mechanics is all we need. But that's what's gotten us into this mess in the first place, using way too much energy, right? So everybody talks about the energy crisis, and for most people, that means, oh, we're running out of energy. For me, it's the opposite. We're using way too much energy. The crisis is we're wasting energy, right? If you look at ecosystems from stably offsetting entropy over time, the aim is not to use more energy, it's to be able to have a stable ecosystem. Yes, there is a principle that says that an ecosystem will use all the energy at its disposal, but the way we're doing it now, at the expense of the foundation, the fabric of life itself, that cannot be in any way something that you could call ethical, right? And for me, being alive and being a part of the ecology that I am makes me feel an imperative to take care of it. It's the same as taking care of your health in a way, right? I mean, why would you want to do that? Why would you want to take care of your health? Well, because it's in your own best interest, right? And it's the same thing with ecology. A little bit more complicated, though.
Great. So, Andrew, we're here in your amazing greenhouse. It's very warm today, and we are in the midst of a wild nature almost, an ecosystem if you will.
Yeah.
Can you tell a bit more about what do you do here?
Sure.
What have you done in order to make this happen, and what do you do here daily?
All right. So as I was talking about earlier, all the beds in this greenhouse have been built. So I only grow in beds, and there are trade-offs to everything. The benefit for being as far north as we are is that it warms up more quickly. But also you're able to quite easily tell, so if people come in, what are the areas that are cultivated. And also for me working, it's easy to divide everything up. I have 6 rows and about 12 cases per row.
Yeah.
So if I'm making plans or whatever, it's easy to know, right? Row 6, case 7. And then, of course I try to rotate so that, I don't have the same plants in the exact same place every year. And I'm always growing in waves, and I don't know any given day what wave I'm on.
Okay.
So I kind of start the day off by first coming into the greenhouse, and the first permaculture principle is observe and interact. So first I walk around the greenhouse first and just scan everything and see, is there anything that urgently is screaming at me for help, right? And then I do that first, right? So it's bottleneck. First open the bottleneck of whatever needs it the most. And then usually as soon as that happens, your mind is already processing what the next thing needs to happen, right? And then you have bigger tasks, general waves of plants that have to go either, like I start the growing season indoors actually, under lights, artificial lights, because the season here is so short. Naturally it would be less than 100 days usually, right? So to open that bottleneck, I start in lights, in windows, and I have a little like 2-meter area with thousands of plants, or at least hundreds. As you can see, you can fit quite a lot of small plants into one area. So in the beginning, the bottleneck is just to sow them. You can have 100 amaranth in that area, right? Easily. And then when they start getting big enough, you can see that they're starting to compete with each other and they're running out of space. Then the bottleneck becomes space, right? So first the first bottleneck would be heat, then it would be light, and then it would be space. So you open them up in that order, right? And some plants like chilies and tomatoes will need a lot longer span. So you then you're planning each bed based on overall plan for the whole greenhouse, and then there's all the gap filling plants, right? Like this coriander or meta, which you fill in between, right? And so then I'm going to try and find a way to create an ecosystem in each bed. So each bed is going to be a unique ecosystem. But it's also going to be related to the beds next to it. Right? So since you think about where the sun goes, sun rises like that, sets over there. And so you think about that in relationship to the height of the plants. So you'll have the highest plants at the back, which in my case are grapes here on this side of the house. So those vines are permanently in place. They've been there since I set up the greenhouse. And they just get bigger and bigger every year. And with them, it's really easy. All I have to do really is trim them once a year. And when I do, I cut them off and I stick them in like a bucket like this. And then when that becomes a bottleneck, I'll open it up and put each plant into individual plants, right? Into individual pots. And of course, half of them might not even sprout. In this case, I got very lucky, right? But if I had put them each into individual pots, I'd be creating a bottleneck for myself in terms of space, right? So you have to think like that all the time. Instead of just throwing all your clippings away, put them into pots, and then you're going to get a bunch of new plants. Lots of plants can be propagated vegetatively and reproductively through seeds. Many plants can be both, right? So it would be a bottleneck if you only grew them for seeds, if you could do both, right? And in some cases, like in alliums, onions, there are hundreds of species. And in this greenhouse house, I may have 30 different alliums. And some of them will cross with each other. And then you'll get some kind of a hybrid, which is fine. But if somebody's asking you, could you share with me which I do, I share with the Norwegian seed savers,
Yeah.
then I need to have the variety that they're asking for.
Yeah.
So in many cases, even though a plant will reproduce, sexually,
Yeah.
you won't allow it to do that if you want to keep it true to kind.
Yeah.
Anyway, making a long story short, here, for instance, I have onions, right?
Yes.
An allium. I can't remember the name of this one, but it's got a nodding head, you can see, and it's a small
So
allium.
it's supposed to be like this.
This is how it looks. This is
Only sad.
no.
No.
It's supposed to be like that, and it's going to have a beautiful flower pretty soon, which is of course going to attract pollinators.
Yeah.
And the coriander, it's got a nice smell.
Like the one we got there.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
So this is another. This is in Norwegian it's called pipeløk.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure if this is the variety that grows on the roofs of houses in the mountains of Norway, but there's a variety that we share called voggo, pipeløk.
Yeah.
And anyway, it's related to that.
Yeah.
So these have been there for 3 years now,
Yeah.
right? And I'll just cut from them. Yeah.
Maybe we can stand up
Sure.
and just you can introduce
Yeah,
them.
yeah. I'll just cut them down, and there'll be more and more. And in the end of the season, of course, I'll collect seeds from them and share them with the seed savers. But like here, everything's happened in waves. So the first wave, when I cleared it out, was I put all these alliums in, and these were all sown in a bunch, and they were down there. And then in the spring, I opened that up and I laid them out. So now I've got a whole row, what was before just a little.
Wow.
So space,
Yeah.
And then the coriander I just threw out.
Yeah.
Right? That's just the easiest. And the same with the atriplex, right? That's a ground cover plant.
Yeah.
But it grows quickly. It's fairly hardy. It doesn't have any needs in terms of you don't have to like worry about bugs eating it or anything. It's aromatic, and you can cut it and cut and come again. So you can take the top bits of it and put it in a salad, and then it'll grow more later on. And same here with these salads, right?
Yeah.
I harvested these salads already once, and soon I'll harvest them a second time.
Yeah.
In fact, now I have to harvest them soon because the Mandan squash, which is a rare cultivar from the Mandan tribe that I'm trying to save seeds from, that's what I'm actually growing here.
Yes.
Or I should say, that's the prime crop in this area, right?
Yeah.
And I have, I think, 13 plants, and
So it continues.
this
all the way.
whole row down to the chilies is Mandan.
Yeah.
And some years I'll grow 30 different varieties of squash. But this year, this is a cucumbriate peppo, right? There's like 5 main species in the squash family. And this year I'm only growing Mandan, the Mandan variety, the rare cultivar Mandan, of the cucumbriate peppo. And that's because I want to produce a lot of seed, and I want to make sure that it's true to kind, so it's not crossed with another variety. And all the peppos, so if you had a zucchini growing here, it would the bumblebee that was here, they love squash, so it would definitely cross-pollinate, no question, right? and then you'd get a mix between a Mandan and a zucchini, right? And
Which could be interesting to eat.
It could be interesting for many different reasons.
Yes.
There's nothing wrong with doing that. In fact, that's how you start creating a new variety, right?
Yeah.
Or one of the ways.
Yeah.
But in my case, since this is a rare cultivar and nobody's producing seeds from it in Norway, I want to keep it true to kind, right? Yeah. Then once after this, I'll have thousands of seeds. Yeah. Then I can start playing with it, right? But first, keep the line clean.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then moving back to the row behind it, I'm thinking again in terms of that they don't compete with each other, but that they complement each other, right?
Yeah.
So right behind that I have garlic, because it's not going to be competing for space. Those are garlic, and in between I have yakun, which is in the daisy family, and that's it'll grow like a sunflower, so it'll get this tall. And on that bed, it's all the way in the front. Yeah. And that's because the sun is going to come like this, and there's going to be a wall of beans here. Yeah. This whole thing is beans and peas, right? Yeah. So last year I had cucumbers there, and cucumbers need nitrogen. So this year I'm not going to put anything in the cucumbriate family there again. I'll put beans there, which are nitrogen binding. Yeah. And that's sort of a part of the rotation, right?
I can see a chili there. Is that a chili?
That is not a chili. That is a shinshu bean. Remember I showed you those big Japanese beans? So that's the first flower of the beans from this year. right?
Wow.
And it has red. It's a different species than, you know, French beans.
It's beautiful.
It's very beautiful,
Yeah.
and they grow. They're really big.
Yeah.
And they also they're since they have it's the biggest seed that I have.
Yeah.
They grow. They take more time.
Yeah.
Right.
I see.
But they're also extremely easy. Obviously, all beans are extremely
yeah.
easy. And yeah.
Yeah. And so you were telling that the first thing you come here in the morning, you come here and you walk around and you observe.
Right.
And then you attend to those urgent
Yeah.
needs that the plants have that you have discovered or observed. And what happens then when you have attended to the most urgent ones?
Well, I mean, then usually there's different levels of what needs to be done, right? So different times of the year, there'll be different things. The first priority is always, in terms of bottlenecks, is how are the plants doing, right? And early in the year, I use these two, which we'll show you later, which are like small greenhouses inside of the greenhouse, and that's also a microclimate inside of a microclimate, which they have heating cables and a little fan, and those are together maybe 5 cubic meters, whereas this whole thing is 900 cubic meters.
Yep.
So I only heat, in terms of energy, I'm only heating less than 1% of the whole greenhouse.
Yeah.
Whereas industrially, this thing would be fired with, you know,
Yeah.
in the entire building, just to heat small plants.
Yeah.
So I can stack 3 or 4 layers of these boxes that you see here on top of each other.
Okay.
Because during the daytime in the winter, it's warm enough in here.
Yeah.
In the spring.
Yeah.
But at night, it isn't.
Yeah.
So I just stack everything on top of each other when it's really cold.
Yeah.
And then I can bring them out again.
Yeah.
So yeah, the first priority is how are the plants doing, you know, and open that up. But then the next priority is make sure that you're keeping control of the weeds.
Okay.
So in the springtime, you have to there's a lot, you can imagine how much weeding there is.
Yep.
But there, you just have to be patient and just do one case at a time, right? And so you always have planned what you're going to do before you get started, right? So you have all the plants waiting, and you think, okay, I know that the end product here is going to be squash. In the meantime, I want to keep the ground covered. That's the first rule of an ecosystem. An ecosystem doesn't want to have open ground anywhere at any time. So what I'll do is I'll either have a green living cover, like with coriander or red in this case, and then any gaps that are left, I'll fill with mulch. And here I have 2 different kinds of mulch to show, right? There's brown mulch, which is carbon rich, and then there's green mulch, right? And that's nitrogen rich. So some plants, if you want a plant to grow fast, and it's a plant that needs nitrogen, like squash do, then you just put a little bit of green mulch close to it, but not so close that it'll rot the base of the plant, which you can see kind of has happened with this one before. You put that around, and then the nitrogen will leach out into the root system around the plants, and it'll start growing. Like you'll see, it'll take off right from that. Of course, given that the heat is appropriate for the plant. And if you mix carbon and nitrogen together at a ratio of 1 to 30 or 1 to 25, that's what you need to make good compost. So you can do that in a big pile, which is what most people think about when you're doing compost.
Exactly.
Or you can do cover composting, where you just mix the two and lay them down like that. And they'll then compost within a few days. Right? In a greenhouse. And you're then protecting that area from weeds, right? And you're feeding the microbiome, and which is the most important thing. You're not actually thinking about feeding the plants, you're feeding the soil. And not even really the soil, you're feeding the microbes in the soil, right? So as long as they have something to eat, they'll exchange their nutrients with the root systems of the plants. The plants are photosynthesizing, and that's taking carbon out of the carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, hydrogen out of the water, making carbohydrates, right? And those carbohydrates are sugars. They are then exchanging with the microbes who are giving them nitrogen and whatever else they need. So it's a cycle, right? And you have to, people are like, oh, how much do you mulch, or how often do you never stop. It's a constant cycle. Like, how often do you eat? 3 times a day, right? Well, I mean, if a plant's hungry, you can see it. These plants are hungry, right?
Yeah.
But if you look at them now,
Yeah.
they've been stressed because it's been cold.
Yeah.
But now that the sun is coming, you can see the center leaves are dark green, right? That means there's enough nutrients in the ground.
Yeah.
They've just been stressed on the outer edge.
Okay.
So now within the next couple of days with this heat,
Yeah.
these plants will explode.
Yeah.
So like in a week or two, this whole area will just be covered with squash.
Yeah.
And then they'll start competing with all of the coriander,
Yeah.
right? And all the ground cover and all the salads. So
you will be
then I'll
eating a
just,
lot of coriander.
I'll be eating coriander, right? Lots of it. And I do this time of year.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, Andrew, what do we have here?
So here is a big mix of different stuff. This is more sort of an experimental bed.
Okay.
Where there's a mixture, but it's a lot of perennials. So the idea for me at least, is to try and go in the direction of perennials, plants that don't go to seed in the first year, and that can overwinter and then come back the next year. So gradually, we'll talk more about this later, but the gradual idea is to perennialize the whole greenhouse, or at least half of it. So in this case here, for instance, we have, this is called flying dragon, which is a citrus plant. And it's overwintered in the greenhouse. And it's the most hardy species of citrus. It's extremely sour. I have never tasted it, but I know it's very sour. So I'll try and find a use for it once I've managed to get it to go to fruit, hopefully. So it's just one of many experiments in here. We also, here you can see it, this is just a plug, so this was an empty space, and I put, this is strawberry spinach, right? So this is an annual plant, and it's related to the red atriplex that we were looking at earlier. But it goes, so it has both spinach leaves, which you can eat, and then it creates these, it shoots up these stalks of, you can call them flowers, that quickly turn to berries, and they get, so that's why it's called strawberry spinach, because it makes kind of strawberries on it.
And you can also eat the berries.
You can, and they're quite tasty.
Yeah.
And
So
it's actually from a monastery in Germany.
Wow.
Yeah. And so the thing is, the nice thing about them also is that when you rinse them, when you rinse the berries, the water becomes red, and then when you empty the water out, you can see a little tiny film of seeds. So every time you clean your berries, you can save the seeds.
Because the seeds are actually outside the berry.
They're in the berry, so when you rinse them, they kind of fall out of the berry.
Okay.
It's kind of like, it looks kind of like a strawberry in that regard,
Yeah.
kind of similar. And if you can see behind it here is a little bit stressed Hablitzia, which is one of the sort of cultivated spinach perennials, the only real semi-cultivated. It's actually more kind of wild. It's used kind of as a decorative plant on walls because it's hardy and it can live on northern walls or walls in the shade, and it's in the same family as strawberry spinach, but it's a perennial. So it's a hardy perennial, and it doesn't actually like these conditions. So where we were earlier filming, there was one on the wall that was 2 meters high already. So this is one that just happened because I have so many seeds everywhere. So this one happened to sprout here, and all right, fine, I'll let it be. And that happens all the time. There's lots of self-seeding going on in this greenhouse, and I, as much as possible, try and let that happen. That saves work, of course. And if you see in between, you'll see like back there, there's some kind of allium. I don't know, Stephen Barstow has given me so many alliums that I've completely lost track. Like here you can see, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different alliums just here. There's, right? And they're nice because you can put them almost anywhere and then just leave them there and harvest whenever you want. And they have beautiful flowers, all different. You see some have tall ones, some have nodding, and you know. And of course really good for insects. Then in the back we have, this is Malabar spinach, right? And this is a smaller plant, whereas back here we have a more mature plant. And these are perennial, and there's the only one in this family that I have in the greenhouse. And you can take cuttings of it, so you can propagate it vegetatively. Traditionally it was used for dyeing. You can see it makes a very strong color. And of course, you know, so that can be used for dyeing. And you obviously can eat the leaves, and very easy to save seeds. So
and
that's,
there's the seed.
Yeah, exactly.
There. It's quite a big seed.
Yeah, it is. And here you can see another perennial. This is hardy kiwi, and it's a vine that will grow the size of a grapevine. And I have, the plan is to continue the back side of the greenhouse, this side with where it can climb all the way up to the middle and cover the whole back side of the greenhouse without competing with anything in front of it.
Yep.
So eventually it'll be grapes on the first half of the wall on the back side of the greenhouse, and then super hardy kiwi, which are these little tiny, they look like about the size of an olive or a grape. And you can eat the kiwi fruit without peeling it.
Wow.
And it's hardy, and it's a climber, so yeah. Then of course I have two different kinds of chili. This is Siberian chili, and this is a second year. These are both Siberian chilies. They're second year plants which I've had in my window. And this is another kind of Tasmanian chili, which is a different species. This is Capsicum anum, and this is Capsicum pubescens. So this one has white flowers, whereas this one has purple flowers.
Wow.
And as you can see, it's already, 1.5 meters tall, and there's another one over there, which is even taller.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take that much space, right? And behind that again, we again have the beans, and then more coriander covering the ground.
Yeah. Beautiful.
And then up front here, we have, of course, this is Angelica, but it's not, the Norwegian saversavers in Norwegian is called kvann, which is Angelica, archangelica, which I can show you. I have a plant of outside. This is this is Angelica chinensis, which is called tomorrow's leaf in English, or ashitaba is sort of the name of it. And it's a semi-wild plant, and it has something in it called chalcones, which is an antioxidant, and it's fluorescent. So if you can see here, as I broke off a leaf, it's called tomorrow's leaf because when you break off a leaf, the next day it starts to grow a new leaf, right? And this sap, it's the only plant in the world that produces this sap. And if you see, you can see how strong that is, right?
Yeah, and the colors.
And it's good for your stomach, and it's good for your heart, right? It's strong, very strong. It's like almost like a turpentine kind of paint, right? Oh. But it's very good for your health. So
it smells really lovely.
Right, but not everybody can eat it. Yeah. Like, I go chew on this, right?
Yeah.
And that helps your system, right?
Wow.
And if you're like me, I have stomach problems. Perfect.
Yeah.
So.
And then
so a lot of
it's like a gum.
Well, kind of. Once you don't eat the pulp, right?
Yeah.
But you're taking all the it's called chalcones. You take in all the chalcones, and then you spit out the pulp. So yeah, that's one. There are many medicinal plants here. Maybe we can move on to some of the other medicinal plants.
Yes, let's do that. Yeah. So what do we have here?
This is Himalayan spikenard, and it's a perennial mountain plant from the Himalayas that possibly this might be the first time that it's flowering in Norway. Wow. At least it hasn't flowered very much before in Norway. And it's an endangered species. And that's because it's been so popular for hundreds of years that it's been collected in the wild almost to extinction. So, it was a holy plant because you can make a really nice essential oil out of it, which, people have used in holy rituals or religious rituals for centuries. So the Catholic Church uses it, the Dalai Lama and Buddhist rituals it's also used, and it's related to, I forgot what it's related to. Oh, God. Valerian. It's related to valerian. All right, let me start again.
Let's start with that. It's related to.
It's related to valerian, which is a kind of a sleeping medicine that you can just buy in the drugstore. But whereas valerian smells terrible and will put you to sleep, this one has a really nice, beautiful smell. And so my hope here is to be able to reproduce the seed so I can share it with other people so that we can help save it from extinction. And this is so this is Himalayan spikenard. Back here we have Japanese spikenard, which is not related to this plant, even though it has the same name, spikenard, in it. So this is Japanese spikenard, or udo it's also called, and it's what's called a sansai plant, which sounds a little bit like bonsai because it's the same. Bonsai means small plant, but sansai means mountain plant, and it's a whole category of plants that are very popular in Japan, Korea, and China, and they traditionally would go up into the mountains and harvest these. But then in the 20s they started moving them into the cities, like in Tokyo. They force these in caves underground. So they keep them out of the sun and in warm places, so they force them without light to grow, and that's called blanching. So what we do instead is we just put a bucket over them in the spring, and when the plant pushes the bucket up, so the bucket starts to lift, then you take the bucket off, chop it down, and you have a blanched vegetable, and it's very early, so well, you know, or fairly early at least. The important thing about it is that it's a mountain plant that can be grown in the shade. It's hardy, so it can be grown just about anywhere in Norway, and it gets bigger and bigger every year. In fact, in Stephen Barstow's garden, he has a udo there that must be over 15 years old, and it grows, I'm supposing, 2.5 meters, and it's maybe 3 meters wide. Right, and so it continues to get bigger and bigger every year, and you can break off pieces of the root, and you'll have new plants.
So, what do you eat of this?
You eat the blanched shoots, right? Sort of like asparagus, right? But you can also eat it like this. You can chop it down and eat it like this if you want. But it takes years to build up stock. So I've been working on. I have like about 100 plants around the farm, and I'm trying to build up stock. So it's weird, like people are, why do you have udo in the greenhouse? It makes no sense. Well, if you compare this udo with the plants that I have in my ravine back there, they're like maybe this big at this stage, right? So by growing them more quickly, I can more quickly build up stock, which is my aim. But eventually I won't have any udo in the greenhouse. Yeah. It'll just be in the ravine. Yeah. But my plan is to slowly, you know, in permaculture you value the edge of your property, right? Yeah. Or your ecosystem. And so the edge of my ecosystem is the ravine. Mm. And so I'm trying to find hardy plants that can tolerate low sun conditions, and this is one of them. Yeah. So yeah, that's udo. Aurelia cortada it's called. So this is a licorice, which is one of the top medicinal plants in Chinese herbology. It's considered to be the #2 Chinese medicinal plant after Panax ginseng. And the reason why it's so popular or used is they use it in all kinds of different herbal remedies because it has very, very sweet root. Yeah. And with good adaptogenic properties. Of course, it takes several years. These are 3-year-old plants, and you can't really start harvesting the root before the 3rd or the 4th year. I'm hoping that this year will be the year finally when they go to seed, and then I'll be able to share seeds with other people. Yeah. It's notoriously hard to get to sprout. Okay. So I know, for instance, the mountain gardens in the States, Joe Hollis, he's been trying to grow this for years, but hasn't been able to get it to go to seed. Really? So it does very well here, and we had it for tea. Yeah, it's quite nice. Yeah. Okay. So here we are with this is it's called Nordica, this grape, which is a beautiful red grape. I'm not a grape expert, but I love it, and I eat way too many grapes when at the end of the season. So last year was actually the first year that we had any grapes at all, and we had way more grapes than we can eat. Wow. We have 7 vines here. Yeah. And this year already, as you can see, it's a ridiculous amount of grapes, so probably twice as much as last year. Yeah. So I'm gonna have to make grape juice or something, wine.
We can already gorgeous. See small grapes coming in.
It's a huge amount.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, it really is.
And why do you want to have this plant here?
Well, it's it's the northern part, right? Yeah. So it's the part that'll fill that gap, right? Yeah. So the aim of is to fill the entire ecosystem.
Yeah.
So the niche of this plant is that it'll climb high,
Yeah.
and it'll occupy a space
Yeah.
that it won't compete with the plants underneath it, right? So even here we've got beans and peas growing.
Exactly.
And that'll become a wall of green.
Yeah.
But it'll still, these plants, the grapes will still be high enough that they'll be able to compete with the beans.
Yeah.
Right? So it's just one of the parts of the puzzle of the ecosystem.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also maximizing the space where you
Maximizing the photosynthesis. So
Yeah.
instead of just thinking in terms of 2 dimensions like
Yeah.
most people do, you're thinking, all the different levels.
and then you'll need ladders.
Well, yeah, there's a ladder here, but I have a ladder which I use all the time.
Yeah.
Every time I string one of these up, I gotta get up there. That's nice.
Yeah. So Andrew, I feel like you have today given us a peek into your world somehow. And even though it has been quite a short time that we've visited your greenhouse and spent time with you, I still feel that I have had a rich experience with you and the plans and with the ideas. And I still want to inquire not only why we are here, but why are you doing this and what keeps you going? What drives you?
Well, for me, it really comes back to doing something practical and something real, tangible, to deal with the crisis of our times. And since we know that the crisis is an ecological crisis, it's a crisis of species going extinct, right? It's the 6th extinction. Not the 1st, the 6th, but this time it's our fault. It's the humans that are the driving force behind it. But I believe that, in permaculture they say the problem is the solution, right? We're the problem, the people, and we are also the solution. We have to be. We can't just say that it's going to be the next generation, or we can't just leave it to chance. We've created the problem, so we have to engineer our way out of it. And you'll hear all kinds of solutions, geoengineering solutions. This is bioengineering solution, right? So you just bioengineer our way back out of it. And you reduce your footprint, your negative footprint, and you increase your positive footprint by linking to your ecosystem, understanding your ecosystem, interacting with your ecosystem, and gradually reconnecting and restoring what's going to be lost. And it's not like I'm under any kind of illusion that this is going to save the world. It isn't. But if everybody went in this direction, or some kind of similar direction where they're relating with biology, relating with the ecosystem, I strongly believe it wouldn't take very many years for us to solve it. The problem is nobody wants to make the big changes. Everybody wants to stay in their comfort zone. Nobody wants to actually do any real work. We think of relating to plants and ecosystems as peasant work, right? But this is the most advanced science there is, right? This is deep philosophy, right? This is going back to what, Aristotle spent his time doing, thinking about how everything hangs together, right? So that's what we need more of. We need more people going deep and not just being stuck in front of their screens and not just interacting with numbers, symbols, economy, right? But interacting with real biology, right? On multiple layers, not just production, but reproduction, right? Seeing how it all fits together and partaking in rebuilding, regenerating the world. Yeah.
Thank you so much.